breach of the principle of distinction under international humanitarian law. Yet Israel has demonstrated virtually no accountability to address these actions, despite calls by the international community, by the 2019 Commission of Inquiry, and by civil society for independent and transparent investigations by Israel into these serious human rights violations. Excellencies, I now wish to turn to the main focus of my current report, the lack of accountability and the endurance of impunity in the course of this 52-year-old occupation, the longest belligerent occupation in the modern world. Above all, this occupation has been characterized by two defining features. First, the conduct of the Israeli occupation has been characterized by numerous, intentional, and serious violations of international law, including human rights and humanitarian law. These violations have been criticized and condemned by a multitude of resolutions coming from the UN General Assembly, the Human Rights Council, and the Security Council, and from other authoritative international bodies. And second, in the face of this persistent defiance and lack of accountability by the occupying power, the international community has displayed great unwillingness to impose any meaningful accountability on Israel for its permanent occupation and its serious violations of international law. In the face of the volumes of UN resolutions insisting that Israel unwind its occupation, end its settlement enterprise, undo its annexation of East Jerusalem, respect all of its international human rights obligations, investigate purported war crimes, facilitate the return of Palestinian refugees, and remove its obligation to the full realization of Palestinian self-determination, Israel has remained profoundly resistant to international direction. Israel has rightly assessed that the international community, particularly the Western industrial nations, has lacked the political will to end this impunity. As a result, it has rarely faced meaningful consequences for its truculent behavior. As the Israeli journalist Gideon Levy has written, and I quote, "No country is as dependent on the support of the international community as Israel, and yet Israel allows itself to defy the world as few dare." For 40 years, the international community has been insisting on full Israeli compliance with the direction of the United Nations. In 1979, the Security Council, in Resolution 446, demanded a complete end to the Israeli settlement enterprise. At the time, in 1979, there were approximately 80,000 Israeli settlers. Today, 40 years later, and notwithstanding more Security Council resolutions on the same demand, there are 650,000 Israeli settlers, an increase of over 800% over the last 4 decades. In Resolution 2334, adopted by the Security Council in December 2016, the Council called on Israel to immediately and completely cease all settlement activities in the OPT, including East Jerusalem. The resolution set up a quarterly reporting mechanism to the Council. In each of its 3 most recent quarterly reports to the Security Council in March, June, and September 2019, the UN Special Coordinator for the Middle East Peace Process has stated that with respect to Israel's compliance with the demand for the complete end of settlement building, and I quote, "No steps were taken to that effect during the reporting period." Excellencies, international law has stated that accountability, which is the duty to account for the exercise of power, is at the heart of our rules-based international order. There are 3 significant sources for the legal obligation that require the international community to marshal its political authority to compel Israel to completely end its illegal occupation and to remove its barriers to the fulfillment of Palestinian self-determination. First is Common Article 1 of the 4 Geneva Conventions, which proclaims that the high contracting parties undertake to respect, but also to ensure respect for the present convention in all circumstances. Secondly, the 2001 Articles on Responsibility of States for International Wrongful Acts, which obligates states to cooperate to bring to an end through lawful means any serious breach of international law, and to not render any aid or assistance in maintaining that situation. And third, there is Article 25 of the Charter of the United Nations, which states that the members of the United Nations agree to accept and to carry out the decisions of the Security Council in accordance with the present Charter. All three of these legal obligations are binding on members of the international community to bring significant violations of human rights and humanitarian law to a complete end. This would include completely ending the illegal Israeli occupation and its associated breaches of international law. This is not, Excellencies, a policy choice. This does not involve a political preference. Rather, it is a solemn legal obligation borne by the entire international community. This issue of impunity and the lack of accountability has been recently addressed by 4 major human rights reports commissioned by the Human Rights Council over the last decade. The constant theme throughout these reports has been the serious violations of human rights and humanitarian law by Israel, which is necessary to ensure Israeli accountability and the prevailing culture of exceptionalism. Let me just briefly summarize them for you. The report into the 2008-09 Gaza conflict stated that, and I quote, "Justice and respect for the rule of law are the indispensable basis for peace. The prolonged situation of impunity has created a justice crisis in the occupied Palestinian territory that warrants action." The 2013 report on the implications of the Israeli settlements called upon Israel, and I quote, "to ensure full accountability for all violations and to put an end to the policy of impunity." The report into the 2014 Gaza conflict expressed concern that, and I quote, "impunity prevails across the board for violations of international humanitarian law and international human rights law allegedly committed by Israeli forces. Israel must break with its recent lamentable track record in holding wrongdoers accountable." And finally, the 2019 report into the Gaza protests found that, and I quote again, "to date, the government of Israel has consistently failed to meaningfully investigate and prosecute commanders and soldiers for crimes and violations. Scarce accountability measures arising out of Operations Cast Lead in 2008-09 and Operation Protective Edge in 2014 cast doubt over the state of Israel's willingness to scrutinize the actions of military and civilian leadership," unquote. Excellencies, are these important reports emanating from the world's leading human rights bodies, all of them rich in evidence with respect to the profound breaches of our common humanitarian and human rights values, and all of them pointing again and again to impunity and exceptionalism, simply to sit on the shelves of our collective memory? Are they destined to live only in the footnotes of the next report, cataloging the next human rights catastrophe that we didn't prevent because we didn't heed the accounts and demands for accountability so clearly laid out for us in the previous reports? Excellencies, speaking recently in another context, Ambassador Jonathan Allen of the United Kingdom stated during a Security Council briefing on international humanitarian law, and I quote, "We don't lack law. We lacked enforcement and accountability." This observation applies with equal force to Israel's conduct in the occupied Palestinian territory. No occupation in the modern world has been conducted with the international community so alert to its many grave breaches of international law, so knowledgeable about the occupiers' obvious and well-signaled intent to annex and establish permanent sovereignty, so well-informed about the scale of suffering and dispossession endured by the protected population under occupation, and yet so unwilling to act upon the overwhelming evidence before it to employ the tangible and plentiful legal and political tools at its disposal to end the injustice. May I conclude with this, Excellencies? If the best time to have planted an oak tree was 20 years ago, the second best time is now. There are two accountability steps that the international community can start to apply immediately in earnest, and that have the potential for finally bringing hope and change to this permanent occupation. The first is to agree upon a complete ban on the export of all products made within the illegal Israeli settlements going to the world market. To continue to import goods and services from these illegal settlements is to aid and assist in the flagrant violation of international law, as Security Council Resolution 2334 has put it. Accepting goods and services imported from the settlements into your home markets provides economic sustainability to the settlements and perpetuates what the Statute of Rome labels as a war crime. And the second accountability step that can be undertaken immediately is for the international community to issue a clarion call to the United Nations to complete the necessary work with respect to the database on businesses engaged in activities related to the illegal Israeli settlements, and to release the database within a short and reasonable time in a fully transparent manner and as a dynamic tool to accurately capture any and all future business activities with respect to the settlements. As I finish, I would like to quote former Secretary General Ban Ki-moon, who said in 2016, addressing the issue of the Israeli occupation, he said, "The lack of any significant movement towards a political resolution and ongoing violations of international human rights and humanitarian law are exasperated by the lack of accountability for previous violations. Tackling impunity," he said, "must be the highest priority." Excellencies, accountability is the key to unlocking the titanium cage that is the endless occupation. Now is the time for the international community to turn that key. Thank you very much.
I thank the Special Rapporteur on the situation of human rights in the Palestinian territories occupied since 1967 for his statement. I now give the floor to those members of the committee who might wish to make comments or ask questions of Mr. Link. In accordance with past practice, I ask delegations to limit their comments to 2 or 3 minutes. All delegations wishing to take the floor are invited to press their button on the console within the next 3 minutes, after which the list will be closed. I thank you for your cooperation. And I have first on my list, State of Palestine. You have the floor.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Chair, allow me to begin by thanking Special Rapporteur Link and expressing our appreciation for his report and his comprehensive presentation today. The State of Palestine takes this opportunity to reiterate our strong support for and full cooperation with the mandate of the Special Rapporteur. Mr. Chair, in his second report to the GA, the Special Rapporteur presents a clear analysis of accountability, impunity, and the responsibility of the international community to bring an end to the occupation of Palestine and other Israeli practices amounting to violations of international, humanitarian, and human rights law. While all of his reports are important and valuable, this report stands out. The reason being is that it is not just a report that reflects the occupying power's denial, denigration, and violation of the rights of the Palestinian people, but it is a report that also contains timely recommendations directed to the international community in regard to international accountability to end Israel's occupation. I should add, an occupation that the Special Rapporteur has determined in itself has become illegal, given its flagrant violations of the foundational principles of the modern laws of occupation. In addition to the above, in his report, the Special Rapporteur also focuses on the continuing shrinking of civic space, pervasive lack of accountability, including in relation to the investigation and prosecution of the crimes of the occupying power in its war against Gaza in 2014, home demolitions in the occupied West Bank and in East Jerusalem, the ongoing use of administrative detention and detention of children, and the impact of various practices by the occupying power on the environment. Clearly, the issues of focus in his report are by no means exhaustive, but they do indicate just how pervasive the labyrinth of Israeli violations are and just how much they are sustaining and entrenching its illegal occupation each and every day in direct contravention and grave breach of international law, including humanitarian, human, and criminal law, and relevant UN resolutions, including countless Security Council resolutions. Mr. Chair, the systematic and incessant violations by Israel against the Palestinian civilian population in occupied Palestine are well known. In fact, and I would like to repeat the point that he made in his presentation today because it really hit home for me while I was reading the report, in which he states that no occupation in the modern world has been conducted with the international community so alert to its many grave breaches of international law, so knowledgeable about the occupier's obvious and well-signaled intent to annex and establish permanent sovereignty, so well-informed about the scale of suffering and dispossession endured by the protected population under occupation, and yet so unwilling to act upon the overwhelming evidence before it to employ the tangible and plentiful legal and political tools at its disposal to end this injustice. And yet, despite this, and the great deal of power that the international community has to ensure a positive, durable, and just solution to end the occupation, the acute lack of accountability, coupled with the abundant impunity that has characterized Israel's conduct of its 5-decade-long occupation, not only continues, but it has intensified. In this regard, in his report, the Special Rapporteur makes many important recommendations that the State of Palestine will surely be studying. But besides the obvious recommendation calling on Israel to end its occupation, the Special Rapporteur has also made a direct recommendation to the international community, and one of them is calling on the international community, and I quote, "In line with Common Article 1 of the Geneva Conventions, the Articles of Responsibility of States, and Article 25 of the Charter of the UN, to take all necessary measures, including countermeasures and sanctions, to ensure respect by Israel and all other relevant parties of their obligations under international law to end the occupation." So, Mr. Chair, our first question to the Special Rapporteur is if he can expand on this recommendation and what this means in the practical sense, and what this would require in order to implement such a recommendation. Could he elaborate on what such countermeasures and sanctions could possibly look like in the case of Israel's occupation? Secondly, we would like to ask the Special Rapporteur to expand more on his other recommendations in his report, which included adopting recommendations of the previous High Commissioner for Human Rights, as well as seeking an advisory opinion of the ICJ on Israel's legal obligation to end the occupation and the international community's legal obligations and powers to ensure accountability and bring an end to impunity. And lastly, his recommendation to commission a UN study on the legality of the annexation and continued occupation of the Palestinian territory. Lastly, Mr. Chair, we would like to place on record again our condemnation of Israel's refusal to cooperate with the mandate of the Special Rapporteur, consistent with its culture of non-cooperation with special procedure mandate holders and other UN mechanisms in violation of its obligations as a UN member state. We call on the SG, the Office of the High Commissioner, and member states to take measures to ensure that this mandate is not obstructed and that Israel is brought into compliance. And I thank you, Mr. Chair.
Je vous remercie.
I thank the representative of the State of Palestine for her statement. There are many requests for the floor, and I will therefore have to reduce statements to 2 minutes. I apologize, but this is something I must do to enable each and every one to take the floor. I now give the floor to the Bolivarian Republic of Venezuela.
Para la República Bolivariana.
With the pre-1967 borders, living side by side with Israel in peace and security. This is why, Mr. Chairman, Senegal reiterates its full support for the Palestinian people as a whole and its appeal to the international community as a whole, including Israel, to redouble efforts in order to improve cooperation with the rapporteur and to respect its commitments with regard to the rapporteur.
Je vous remercie.
I thank the representative of Senegal for that statement, and I now give the floor to Norway.
Chair, Norway thanks the Special Rapporteur for his report to the committee. Norway is deeply concerned about the further deterioration of human rights situation for Palestinians living in Gaza and the West Bank, including East Jerusalem. The people in Gaza suffer through a continuing man-made humanitarian and human rights crisis and find themselves repeatedly at the brink of war. In the West Bank, the population faces home demolitions, settlement expansions, violence by security forces and settlers, extensive use of administrative detention, and the denial of access to natural resources. Norway is particularly concerned about reports of continued violence and intimidation by the settler population towards Palestinians in Hebron. Such incidents cannot be allowed to occur with impunity. These and other developments threaten the prospects for a negotiated two-state solution. Israel bears a major responsibility for the human rights abuses we are discussing today. Norway also urges the Palestinian Authority to intensify efforts to fulfill their obligations under international human rights law. Furthermore, we remain deeply concerned about human rights abuses taking place in Hamas-controlled Gaza, including by its security forces. Chair, Norway urges Israel to grant access for the Special Rapporteur in order for him to fully carry out his mandate. Finally, we would like to ask the Special Rapporteur to share ideas on how we best can maintain and enhance any progress that has been made over the past year. I thank you, Chair.
Je vous remercie, Madame.
I thank the representative of Norway for her statement, and I now give the floor to Cuba. Thank you, Chair.
I will, in the short time left to me, try to answer some of the questions that have been raised. I was asked, with respect to recommendations on countermeasures that the international community can wind up considering. I was also asked to expand upon one of my recommendations with respect to advisory opinion and on a study of illegal occupation. Let me take those questions first. The essential message coming from my report, the essential message I'm hearing from my contacts with civil society, Israeli, Palestinian, regional, and international, with respect to this 52-year-old occupation, is that the international community must go beyond criticism to actually enforcing consequences for its continuation. This occupation will not die of old age. This occupation will only end with a decisive intervention by the international community to fulfill its own legal obligations to bring the violations of humanitarian and human rights law to an end. In my report, I draw initially from a number of best practices articulated by the International Committee of the Red Cross in its 2016 commentary on Article Number 1. And let me just repeat several of them that are in my report where they lay out what should be done to bring an outlier, defiant state back into compliance with international law. They talk about measures of retortion, such as the halting of ongoing negotiations or refusing to ratify agreements already signed, or the non-renewal of trade privileges, or the reduction or suspension of voluntary public aid. They talk about adopting lawful countermeasures, such as arms embargoes, trade and financial restrictions, flight bans, or the end of cooperation agreements, or refusing arms transfers, or referring the matter to a competent international organization, which I'll address in a second, such as the International Court of Justice, resorting even in examples such as penal measures to repress violations of humanitarian law, or to bring national and international efforts, and this includes using universal jurisdiction to bring suspected perpetrators of serious violations of international humanitarian law to justice. Many countries have adopted both the 4 Geneva Conventions and the 1998 Rome Statute into their domestic law. There should be no good reason why, with those statutory enhancements already within domestic law, to be able to exercise the right of universal jurisdiction to bring purported perpetrators to justice if they happen to be on the soil of this particular country. With respect to my comment on advisory opinion, I am echoing a recommendation issued by the then High Commissioner for Human Rights in 2017 in a major report on accountability with respect to the Israeli occupation, where he asked for the General Assembly, and I second this suggestion, this recommendation, to use its powers under Article 96 of the Charter of the United Nations to seek an advisory opinion to the International Court of Justice to ask 2 questions. One, is the 52-year-old Israeli occupation now crossed the bright red line into illegality? And there are many precedents for this, not least of which would be the Namibia ruling by the International Court of Justice in 1971. And second, to ask the International Court of Justice for its opinion with respect to the measures that the international community are both allowed to do and are obliged to do to bring an offending and defiant state into compliance with international law. The third point I would make is with respect to an illegal occupation. I think in preparation for asking for an advisory opinion to the International Court of Justice, the United Nations General Assembly should commission a study as to whether or not the 52-year-old occupation has actually crossed the bright red line into illegality. And I say that I think this would be a very useful means for trying to hasten the end of the occupation. When you consider it, there are 4 principal cornerstones of the laws of occupation for how an occupier should be conducting its occupation. 1, it has to be temporary. It cannot be indefinite, and it certainly cannot be permanent. Second of all, there can be no annexation of even an inch of the occupied territory. Third, the occupying power has to conduct its occupation in good faith. And fourth, the occupying power has to follow all of the international law and the international directions coming from the United Nations and other respected international bodies. I'll answer one last question, knowing that my time is winding up. I've been asked by the European Union as to what my priorities for the year to come are. I welcome the question. My report in March 2020 to the Human Rights Council will almost certainly be on the issue of collective punishment as a defining feature of the Israeli occupation. In particular, with respect, we all know that collective punishment is a violation of Article 33 of the 4th Geneva Convention. Next time I appear in front of you in October 2020, I actually plan to issue another report on accountability. There is so much to say with respect to this, and I hope to come back in a year's time with a second report on accountability that will address issues with respect to practical measures that the international community can wind up taking. Thank you very much for your patience in listening to my report and to my oral presentation, and good luck with your work.
I thank Mr. Link, the Special Rapporteur on the situation of human rights in the Palestinian territories occupied since 1967. I now invite Mr. Javaid Rehman, Special Rapporteur